She walked into the bank holding nothing but a worn cloth sack. The receptionist smirked. The manager called security. Customers chuckled under their breath. After all, what could a frail old woman possibly demand? But inside that bag were original ownership papers and a legacy someone had tried to erase. So when does confidence become arrogance, and who gets to decide what history remembers? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories like this to light. Thank you for being here. The morning started like most others at Hope National Bank. Soft jazz trickled through the speakers. Freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the marble floor gleamed under the sunlight. Chloe Miller was behind the desk, adjusting her earrings while casually texting under the counter. No one noticed the door open gently. Odessa Bell Jenkins stepped inside wearing a faded blue coat and low-heeled shoes that had long outlived their shine. Her hands held tight to a cloth bag, its seams worn, its color dulled by time. No one offered her a seat. No one asked if she needed help. She didn't cause a scene. She just waited. And somewhere between that silence and the glances that didn't linger, something began to shift. What no one realized was that she wasn't lost. She was here to reclaim what was hers. It was a Monday morning like any other at the Hope National Bank in Savannah. The kind of day where polished shoes clicked across marble tiles, and the scent of strong coffee floated out from the break room into the lobby. Customers came and went, most with their heads down, flipping through emails or waiting for their number to flash above the teller booths. When Odessa Bell Jenkins stepped through the front door, she didn't fit, not in the way her worn gray coat clashed with the corporate blue and white surroundings, or the way her knitted hat tilted a little to one side, but in the way time seemed to slow for a second. The security guard, Roy, always neat, always watching, shifted his posture, eyes narrowing. It wasn't that she looked dangerous, just out of place. Her cloth bag hung from one shoulder. It was faded, frayed at the seams, and had a stitched name, Nathaniel, barely visible in gold thread. The name meant nothing to most, but it meant everything to her. She walked with quiet steadiness toward the reception desk, where Chloe Miller, young and sharp, twirled her pen between two fingers while chatting on her Bluetooth headset. Chloe caught sight of Odessa and immediately lowered her voice. She gave a quick, flickering glance at the older woman's shoes, scuffed leather, well worn, and then looked back at her screen, already assuming this would be quick. Probably someone confused about a deposit. Maybe a loan denial. The usual. Odessa cleared her throat gently. "I'm here," she said, her voice even but soft. "To access my office." Chloe blinked, then let out a short, surprised laugh that she quickly masked with a polite smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your office?" She spoke louder now, enough for nearby customers to turn their heads. A murmur ran through the room, light and dismissive. Odessa didn't flinch. She just nodded once, then reached up and carefully set her cloth bag onto the smooth granite countertop. The bag landed with a soft thud, like something heavier than it looked had just touched down. Chloe straightened. Her tone shifted to a practiced, clipped courtesy. "Which department are you with, ma'am?" Odessa didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the bag. Chloe pressed a button under the desk, paging Paul Mercer, the branch manager. Paul emerged from the glass office moments later, adjusting the cuffs on his shirt. He had that polite half-smile he used for both difficult clients and overly enthusiastic interns. "Good morning," he greeted. "Can I help you?" Odessa looked at him, really looked, like she was trying to see not just the man, but the building behind him. "I'd like to enter my office," she repeated, calmly. Paul tilted his head slightly, the smile still there but thinner now. "And who are you here to see exactly?" She placed her hand atop the bag. Her fingers rested there like she was grounding herself in something no one else could see. Her gaze wandered past him, toward the hallway lined with doors, some glass, some wood, all locked. In the silence that followed, a man waiting in one of the lobby chairs leaned toward his wife. "Jenkins. That name sounds familiar. Wasn't there a Jenkins on the original board back in the day?" The wife shook her head, uninterested. Chloe crossed her arms. Paul's polite smile had started to shift into confusion, maybe even the beginning of irritation. Still, Odessa said nothing more. She just stood there, hand resting gently on that bag, eyes focused somewhere no one else could follow. And the room, for a moment, forgot to breathe. The air outside felt heavier than it did when she first walked in that morning. As Odessa stepped away from the double doors of the bank, the voices inside still echoed faintly in her mind. Not the exact words, but the tone, casual dismissal laced with amusement. She didn't turn back, she just kept walking, her steps steady, even if her breath wasn't. Back in Garden City, the old 3-story apartment building greeted her with peeling paint and mailboxes that had seen better days. The wooden stairwell creaked beneath her weight, complaining in familiar ways. She took each step slowly, as though the building itself remembered her rhythm. On the landing of the 3rd floor, she paused for a moment before unlocking her door, the metal key scraping gently against the lock she'd used for nearly 40 years. Inside, the apartment was quiet and tightly kept, the kind of quiet that holds memories like folded linen. Odessa slipped off her coat, hung it beside the door, and walked over to the far wall where a gallery of old black and white photographs stretched across uneven wallpaper. She ran her finger along the frame of one photo, paused, then carefully lifted it from its hook. In the image, 4 men stood side by side, stiff and proud. Her grandfather, Nathaniel Jenkins, stood second from the left, tall, dark-skinned, and solemn-eyed, flanked by 3 white men in sharply pressed suits. The photo was dated in pencil on the back. Hope National Bank, founding year 1927. Odessa held the picture close, studying the faint crack in the emulsion, the fading corners. Then she made her way to the kitchen, setting water to boil, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a chipped teacup from the cupboard. As she waited, her eyes caught her own reflection in the narrow mirror above the sink. A question floated up, uninvited but insistent. If I'm gone, who will tell the rest of it? She sat down at the table, unbuttoned the cloth bag beside her, and began laying out its contents. Carefully, reverently, the envelope holding original share certificates. A creased letter written by hand, yellowed and brittle. A legal draft naming her as successor, unsigned, but stamped by a notary long dead. These were not just documents. They were fragments of truth. Evidence of a name once spoken in boardrooms and then systematically erased. She reached for the tea, but the cup slipped slightly against her palm. Just enough for the small crack in the porcelain to catch the light. Just enough to remind her how even the strongest vessels can be chipped and set aside. She stared into the amber liquid, the steam curling toward her cheeks. What burned inside her now wasn't rage. It wasn't vengeance. It was something quieter, older, and heavier. A duty passed down, not out loud, but in looks, in silence, in a child's memory of a man who said, "You protect a thing not because it's easy, but because it's right." She whispered to herself, "I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to remember him." For a long while, she sat in silence, the sounds of traffic outside fading into the background. Then, slowly, she began gathering the papers again, each one folded gently, wrapped inside a soft cotton cloth. She placed them back into the bag, the same bag that had once belonged to her grandfather. And then, with practiced care, she retrieved a needle and thread from the drawer. The side of the bag had started to fray, a small tear forming just below the seam. Odessa threaded the needle, held the fabric steady, and began to stitch. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each loop of thread closing a gap, each pull of the needle a quiet rebellion. A tear in history, long left open, was finally being mended. Morning at the bank moved like clockwork. The lights overhead buzzed low. The printers behind the glass cubicles clicked steadily, and the smell of brewed coffee drifted from the corner break room. Everything was as it had always been, orderly, brisk, familiar, until Odessa Bell Jenkins walked through the door again. She didn't hesitate. Her steps were unhurried but sure. Her cloth bag, worn and patched, hung at her side, and she headed straight for the reception desk. Chloe Miller looked up, startled for just a second before her expression reset to polite detachment. Odessa didn't wait for a greeting. She reached into her bag and pulled out a plastic folder, yellowed at the edges but sealed carefully. Inside it, a share certificate dated 1930. The paper slightly curled, but every letter sharp and legible. She placed it gently on the counter and looked Chloe in the eye. I would like to speak with your legal department, she said evenly. This is family property, and this bank is built on it. Chloe's mouth opened, but no words came. She glanced toward the hallway, toward Paul Mercer's office, as if silently pleading for rescue. Her fingers hovered over the desk phone, uncertain whether to call for assistance or simply pretend none of this was happening. Behind them, a few customers were seated in the waiting area. One of them, a young man in a charcoal blazer with a laptop open on his knees, looked up at the sound of Odessa's voice. Jeremy Klein, a local real estate lawyer, had been preparing documents for a refinance deal, but something in her tone, or perhaps the paper in her hands, caught his attention. Paul Mercer appeared within moments, smoothing his tie as he approached. He wore the same smile as yesterday, though today it didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning again," he said, his voice calm. "Let's not create a scene. Please take a seat, and we'll have someone review your documents." Jeremy stood up. "If I may," he said, addressing Paul and Chloe both. "I've handled trust disputes and historical equity transfers. May I take a look?" There was a pause. Paul hesitated, caught between brushing off an old woman and ignoring someone with an actual law license. Finally, he gave a small nod. Odessa passed the folder to Jeremy without a word. He flipped through the papers with the speed of someone trained to skim, but his expression shifted gradually from passive interest to something sharper. He read the certificate, then the attached affidavit, then the second page. His brow furrowed, and he looked up, visibly taken aback. "These are not copies," he said slowly. "These are originals, and if they're legitimate, we're talking about a foundational ownership claim, possibly suppressed records." Customers in the lobby were no longer just eavesdropping, they were fully watching now. A few leaned forward. One older man set his newspaper down completely. Paul stepped in. "That's premature," he said quickly. "We can't allow anyone to." "I didn't ask to be allowed," Odessa interrupted, softly but firmly. She turned to Jeremy. "I've brought them because I knew the day would come when someone would finally look without laughing." Paul's tone sharpened. "Until we can validate any of this, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The room was still. Chloe stood with her hands folded tightly across her midsection. Jeremy looked unsure whether to stay or follow Odessa out. But Odessa only smiled, quiet, unfazed. "I'll leave," she said, picking up her bag again. "But next time, I won't be asking." As she turned to go, a woman stepped into the lobby from the hallway, older, with silver hair pulled back in a soft bun and a lanyard around her neck that read, "Records and Archives." Edna Monroe had worked in the backrooms of the bank for nearly 3 decades. She had seen names come and go, some remembered, some erased. Odessa stopped, eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they didn't speak. Edna tilted her head slightly, searching the other woman's face. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I remember that name. Jenkins." "I do." Odessa gave a small nod and walked out into the bright, indifferent daylight. The door closed behind her. But something had shifted. Not loud, not fast, but real. The blinds in Paul Mercer's office were drawn halfway, letting in a pale strip of morning light that sliced across the long meeting table. A pot of untouched coffee steamed near the window, going cold by the minute. Chloe Miller sat stiffly in one of the chairs, her phone in hand but unused for once. Across the table, 2 assistant managers and a compliance officer scrolled through the scanned copies that had just arrived from the front desk scanner, the documents the old woman had handed over. Paul stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched as he stared at the projection on the wall. The screen showed a certificate dated 1930 with a familiar but long-forgotten name, Nathaniel Jenkins. "This," Paul said, voice firm, "is not how ownership works. One piece of yellow paper doesn't rewrite 90 years of structure. This is a disturbance, a stunt." No one responded. One assistant cleared her throat, but said nothing. Chloe kept her eyes low. She had never seen Paul this tightly wound. Not even during the merger scare 2 years ago. His confidence today felt different, thinner, like it was holding back something else. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, the smell of dust and old ink hung thick in the air as Odessa stepped inside the public records room at City Hall. The lights flickered as they always had, buzzing above stacks of forgotten drawers and cracked filing cabinets. Edna Monroe greeted her without a word, just a nod, and led her to a table near the back, where the old archives were kept. The two women, one with a cloth bag, the other with a badge that would expire in less than 30 days, worked in silence. It took time. The papers were delicate, some barely legible. Odessa's fingers, though aged, moved with the precision of memory. Edna, once merely a passive keeper of records, was now reading each page like she was seeing them for the first time. Then Edna stopped. She held up a page, thin, with a handwritten annotation in red pencil. The name, Nathaniel Jenkins, was typed in the margin of a 1930 document listing the founding investors of Hope National Bank. But across that name, a single line had been drawn with a ruler. Next to it, someone had written, "Replace Charles Whitford." Edna said nothing at first. She simply stared at the paper. Her hand trembled slightly. They found more. A folded letter, signed in shaky cursive by Nathaniel in 1943, left to the city for safekeeping but never processed. The last line was unmistakable. "My shares and legacy, should I not survive, shall belong solely to my granddaughter, Odessa Bell Jenkins." The silence between the two women thickened. Edna whispered, This was never in the digitized records. No wonder nobody found it. But it's real." Odessa's voice came steady, quiet. "That's why I came to you. I knew the truth had to live somewhere, even if it got buried." Back at the bank, Paul was reading an email on his desktop with increasing tension in his brow. The subject line alone made his mouth go dry. Request for meeting, Regional Counsel Historical Claim. The message was short. A legal representative from the district office wanted a formal sit-down regarding documents submitted by one, Odessa Bell Jenkins. He pushed away from his desk, nearly knocking his chair. Chloe turned toward him just as he stormed out of his office into the hallway. Then back again, slamming the door shut behind him. Chloe waited a beat before following, quietly pulling the door open a crack. Paul was pacing. "She's bluffing," he muttered, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Chloe spoke low, almost hesitant. "If she's not, you know what that means. You know what it opens up." Paul didn't answer at first. Then he turned to her, eyes sharp but uncertain. "Then make sure she doesn't get the chance to open anything." His voice was lower now, not angry, calculated, and for the first time, Chloe didn't look convinced. The phone rang just after 4. Its sound breaking through the quiet hum of Odessa's apartment like a knock on an old door. She was at the kitchen table, refolding a letter from 1943 for what must have been the 20th time. The paper had softened at the edges, no longer crisp, but she knew every word. She moved slowly toward the receiver, the way one might approach a conversation they've rehearsed but never quite dared to have. "Mrs. Jenkins?" The voice on the other end was steady, formal, but not cold. "My name is Gerald Hughes. I represent the Regional Legal Office for Historic Asset Claims in Chatham County." Odessa didn't answer immediately. "I've reviewed the documents you submitted. Some of what you have in your possession, well, let's say it raises questions that deserve a hearing. I'd like to invite you to meet me in person tomorrow morning, if you're able." The call was brief, respectful. He didn't offer promises, but he didn't brush her aside either. That, in itself, was a shift. The next morning, Savannah's streets carried the scent of coming rain. Odessa wore her best coat, one she hadn't taken out in years. She carried the cloth bag close to her chest as she entered the government building. Inside, the air smelled of old floor wax and photocopied paper. She was led to a small, beige conference room with a round table and 3 chairs already occupied. Gerald Hughes rose when she entered. He was younger than she expected, maybe early 40s, with salt just beginning to touch the edges of his beard. His suit was simple but clean, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, motioning to the seat beside him. Across from him sat 2 other men. One introduced himself as a records analyst from the city's legal department. The other, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a wedding ring worn to a soft shine, remained silent. He nodded in greeting but didn't offer his name. Odessa noticed he hadn't touched the glass of water in front of him. On the table were printed packets, her documents, neatly bound and tabbed. Gerald opened one and turned to a page near the center. "This certificate of equity," He began, tapping the page lightly. Bears a seal from 1930 that hasn't been used since the Depression. The ink has bled a little, but it's authentic, and the handwriting, especially this portion here, matches existing records of your grandfather's original business filings. Odessa nodded, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her fingers itched to reach into her bag, to pull out the originals again. But she waited. Gerald continued, flipping to another tab. This letter, dated 1943, includes witness initials, and while the notary is long deceased, we've confirmed the stamp and signature match archived legal filings from the same year. He paused, closing the packet gently. If this is accurate, and so far, it appears to be, it could mean that the bank knowingly removed your grandfather's name from its ownership history. Possibly to protect financial interests. Possibly due to social pressures of the time. Either way, it's not something we can dismiss. Odessa leaned forward slightly, her voice low but clear. He built that bank, brick by brick. He negotiated the loans, sat in meetings where he wasn't offered a glass of water. And when he died, they buried more than his name, they buried the truth. Her words hung in the room, not as accusation, but as memory reclaimed. For the first time, the quiet man in the charcoal suit shifted. He hadn't spoken, but now his hand moved slowly to the edge of the packet. He turned one page, then another. His face stayed neutral, but his posture told another story. A tension in the jaw, a twitch of the thumb against the edge of the paper. Gerald noticed it too. He said nothing but made a mental note. Then he looked at Odessa again. I will be submitting a formal request to meet with Hope National Bank's legal representatives. Not in private, not behind closed doors, but formally, on record. He hesitated just long enough to meet her eyes. You need to know this may not be quiet for long. If this goes forward, you will be standing across from people who've spent years keeping this silent. And they have resources, influence, ties to boards and families that still sit high on the hill. Odessa didn't flinch. She reached for her bag, opened the flap, and took out one last paper, her birth certificate. Creased and sun-faded, with her grandfather's name written in neat, strong script beside her own. I've carried this long enough, she said. I'm ready to put it down where others can see it. Gerald gave a slow nod. In the corner, the man in the suit closed his folder, lips pressed in a line. His silence wasn't disinterest, it was calculation. And something else, the smallest flicker of something like worry. The rain tapped gently against the windowpanes that night, a steady rhythm that filled the silence in Odessa's small apartment. The only light came from the desk lamp, its soft yellow glow stretching across the worn table and illuminating the edges of a black and white photo in a thin wooden frame. It was the one she always returned to. Her grandfather, Nathaniel Jenkins, stood straight-backed and formal, eyes steady beneath a brimmed hat, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked proud, not the kind of pride that shows off, but the kind built on quiet conviction. Odessa sat in her chair with a wool blanket draped over her knees. Her fingers curled around a pen that hesitated over a small leather notebook. She had used this notebook for grocery lists once. Later, for family birthdays. Now, it was pages of notes, thoughts, names, and questions. On a blank line near the bottom of the page, she wrote in slow, sloping script. Not for fame. Not for money. Just because he deserves to be remembered. The phone rang again. A quiet buzz from the side table. She let it ring once before answering. Mrs. Jenkins. Gerald's voice came through, calm but purposeful. I wanted to let you know that we've received a proposal from the bank's legal team. They're willing to settle privately, confidentially, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement and a formal withdrawal of your claim. He paused, letting the implication settle. You'd be compensated, of course. And your grandfather's records would be retained internally. Odessa closed her eyes. And if I don't sign? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Gerald's tone softened. Then we go public, with all the scrutiny, with all the noise, with all the risk, and we prepare for a fight. She thanked him and hung up. For a long while, she just sat there, hands resting on the edges of her notebook. Then her mind drifted, years back, to a school field trip she had chaperoned for her daughter's class. One of the boys, a quiet kid with thick glasses, had been left out of the group photo. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had called him over. It wasn't cruel, just careless. But she'd noticed, and the boy, years later, had thanked her in a letter. "You remembered I was there," he wrote. That mattered. She thought of all the people who were never in the photos. The ones who built things and were forgotten. Not by time, but by design. The next morning, the air was thick with humidity, and the sky hung low. The press conference was held in a modest community auditorium, not far from City Hall. Rows of chairs filled quickly with reporters and local historians, curious onlookers, and a few sharply dressed strangers whose names didn't appear on the sign-in sheet. Odessa sat quietly in the wings, waiting for her turn. Her bag was on her lap. Her fingers traced the seam she had repaired just days earlier. Gerald introduced her simply, a citizen, a granddaughter, a witness to history. She walked to the podium with a grace that came not from rehearsed words, but from a lifetime of waiting to be heard. She did not read from notes. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the original will, yellowed, fragile, carefully laminated. She held it up for the cameras to see. "My grandfather's name is not on any plaque at Hope National Bank. But it should be," she said. "This paper isn't just a will. It's a record of trust. And this bank, and this city, broke that trust when they erased his name." There were no raised voices. No dramatics. Just her voice, steady and clear. "I don't want money. I'm not here to claim a seat on a boardroom. I'm here because truth matters. And silence, even when it's convenient, is not the same as peace." Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for approval, but for understanding. "I choose truth," she said, "even if it's messy, even if it's late, even if it shakes foundations that some would rather keep untouched." The room was still. Cameras clicked. Microphones leaned forward. Gerald nodded once beside her, his expression unreadable but resolute. And near the back, half shadowed by the exit sign, stood Edna Monroe, no longer just the quiet librarian of records. She was watching like someone who had remembered a story she thought she'd forgotten. Her eyes shimmered, not from sadness, but from something older, deeper, something like vindication. The courtroom was not grand. No towering ceilings or oak-paneled walls. No cameras. No crowd packed shoulder to shoulder. But there was a stillness inside that pressed on the skin, like the air itself had been asked to behave. At the front, behind a long desk polished to a dull sheen, the judge sat quietly, reviewing her file. To the right, a narrow table bore the weight of documents, copies, and evidence arranged with care. Odessa sat at that table, shoulders straight, hands folded atop the worn fabric of her cloth bag. The same bag she had carried for years. The same bag that now held pieces of truth others had spent decades trying to forget. Paul Mercer sat at the opposite table, flanked by a sharply dressed man with slicked back hair and a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. Paul's face was composed, but every so often his fingers tapped the wood beneath the table. Quiet and restless, Gerald Hughes stood between them. Calm, measured, he spoke first, his voice neither aggressive nor theatrical. "Your Honor, we are not here today to argue for restitution. There is no monetary demand, no claim of damages. We are here for one thing only: the acknowledgement of a man erased from the record of something he helped build." He held up a single page, the original certificate of ownership bearing the name Nathaniel Jenkins. Then a notarized letter from 1943. Then, finally, the photograph. 4 men standing side by side. One of them, unmistakably Nathaniel, his name etched clearly beneath the image. The courtroom remained silent. No objection was raised yet. Only the quiet shifting of weight. The sound of a page turned somewhere in the gallery. Then the bank's lawyer rose. "There is no record," he began, "no official, current record that shows Mr. Jenkins as a shareholder or founding member of Hope National Bank. The name was never included in our contemporary filings. We cannot act on claims based on photos and stories, no matter how compelling." Gerald didn't flinch. "No current record," he repeated, "because the old records were altered." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the witness bench. "I call Edna Monroe." The woman who stepped forward wore a navy blouse and carried a manila folder hugged tightly to her chest. She walked with the calm of someone used to being overlooked. But today, she was here to be seen. From the folder, She pulled a single page. This was found in the internal archive room. She said, her voice steady, typed in 1943. The same year Mr. Jenkins's name was removed from external documents. It acknowledges his standing as a senior shareholder. It also shows his replacement, Charles Whitford, was appointed by closed vote without formal transfer. There was a pause. The judge asked, "Is this document verified?" "It matches the machine typeface of the period. And the ink has been dated," Edna replied. "And it was buried, intentionally." Gerald nodded, then turned. "One more witness. Chloe Miller." There was a stir. Chloe, sitting near the back, hesitated. She rose slowly, her steps quieter than usual. When she reached the stand, she didn't look at Paul. Not once. She sat, hands in her lap. Her voice was soft. "I was asked to manage incoming correspondence related to historical archives when this all started," she said. "A few weeks ago, I received an internal email referencing records tied to the name Jenkins." She paused. Her throat worked. "I deleted it." The courtroom seemed to lean forward. "Why?" the judge asked. Chloe glanced toward Odessa. "Because I thought it was just noise. Just some old woman making trouble. I didn't think it mattered." She turned her head fully now, eyes meeting Odessa's. "I was wrong," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry." The words weren't dramatic, but they landed like weight on wet earth. Gerald stepped forward again. "Mr. Mercer," he said evenly, "do you know why Mrs. Jenkins never filed a claim for financial return? Why she didn't sue your institution, despite having every right to?" Paul didn't respond. Gerald asked again, not louder, but deeper. "Do you know why all she asked for was a name to be restored on a wall?" Paul's hands, now folded on the table, tightened for a fraction of a second. He looked down, then up at the judge, then at Odessa. Still, he said nothing. And somehow, that silence echoed louder than anything that had come before. The ceremony was quiet. No music, no podium, no ribbon to cut. Just the sound of shoes on marble tile and the occasional hushed murmur passing between a handful of attendees. It was a Tuesday morning. The kind that came and went for most people without notice. But inside the main lobby of Hope National Bank, a small gathering stood before a new addition to the wall. A polished brass plaque, no bigger than a legal sheet of paper, had been mounted just left of the main staircase. The letters, engraved deep and clean, read, "Nathaniel Jenkins, co-founder, 1927. There was no press, no cameras, just a few bank employees, a couple of legal representatives, and a woman from the Historical Society who had insisted on bringing a small flower arrangement. Paul Mercer was not among them. He had quietly resigned weeks before, citing health reasons in a memo that no one had replied to. Chloe Miller still worked at the bank, but now in records and compliance, a position with fewer public eyes and quieter expectations. She stood at the back of the room now, her hair tied back, eyes fixed on the plaque. She didn't smile, but she stayed. Odessa arrived late. She hadn't meant to, but the truth was, she didn't want to walk into the lobby while the others were standing there. She waited outside until the small crowd had begun to thin, then stepped through the doors as sunlight pooled on the floor beneath the rotunda. She didn't speak, didn't wave or nod at anyone. She walked with her usual pace, slow, but deliberate, and stopped a few steps away from the plaque, close enough to see the reflection of her own face in the brass. Beside her stood a young girl, 10 years old, hair pulled into neat braids, a spiral notebook clutched in her arms. She was Edna Monroe's granddaughter, curious and observant, her eyes locked on the name in front of her. Odessa looked down at her and smiled. Then, from the cloth bag, now empty except for one last thing, she pulled out an old green pen. It was worn smooth from time and use. The ink likely dried up, but its presence still carried weight. She bent slightly and placed the pen into the girl's hand. "My grandfather used to write with this," she said gently. "You don't have to keep it. Just make sure you write something that matters." The girl looked up at her, eyes wide, not quite understanding, but somehow knowing it was important. Odessa's bag, once filled with documents and proof and history, now hung light on her shoulder. The tear she had stitched was still visible, but the fabric held firm, the seam clean. She no longer carried the past inside it. Just the memory of what had been said right. She didn't linger near the plaque. Instead, she walked to a stone bench just outside the lobby windows. The afternoon light spilled in at an angle, catching the edge of the brass and casting its reflection against the wall. The letters shimmered slightly, like they were breathing. Odessa sat, the bench cool beneath her. She held a paper cup of tea between her palms, steam curling up and disappearing into the warm spring air. Her eyes closed, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something like peace. For the first time in decades, there was nothing left to carry. She never raised her voice, but the silence around her began to shift. The plaque didn't make a sound when it was nailed to the wall, but somehow, it spoke louder than anyone ever had. And maybe that's what truth looks like, when it's finally allowed to stand still. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, or even just a pause, subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that echo long after they end. Thank you for watching.